Is it indisputable to you that Jesus Christ existed?
Jesus Christ actually existed, actually walked this world, did predict his own death and resurrection, and then if you could have a camera running on the tomb in and around 33 AD, that an actual Jesus would have walked out on the third day after his crucifixion and burial.
Now, again, to play devil's advocate,
In this powerful interview, Piers Morgan speaks with Wes Huff, a Christian scholar and the Vice President of Apologetics Canada, asking rapid-fire questions about the historical Jesus, his claim to be God, and the evidence for his resurrection. Wes answers with brilliance and boldness, tackling some of the most difficult questions skeptics have ever raised about Christ.
what's interesting...
Okay, so what's interesting is I actually met Wes like 10 years ago at a Canada Power to Change conference, and so that was really cool.
Think about your perspective on this from your history and your studying, is that you believe a lot of the New Testament is unarguably factually true.
I do, yeah, and I think that that's demonstrable from the actual evidence that we can look at.
Is it indisputable to you that Jesus Christ existed, for example?
Oh, definitely so. I think we can say pretty unequivocally that a character, a first century Jewish itinerant rabbi by the name of Jesus of Nazareth, did walk the dusty streets of first century Roman occupied Judea. I think that even the most skeptical scholars will grant that if we know very little about Jesus, we know that he did exist and that he was crucified in and around the beginning of the first century under the overseeing of the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Jesus Christ.
And you know, one of the interesting things about Jesus is that he's one of the most talked about, most written about figures in human history. There's more documents written about Jesus than there is about Shakespeare, if I'm getting that correctly. I think there's also more evidence for us to know that Jesus existed than Julius Caesar. So if you believe Shakespeare existed, if you believe Julius Caesar existed, it makes sense you believe that Jesus existed too, because that's what the evidence just shows.
Actually existed, actually walked this world, did predict his own death and resurrection, and then if you could have a camera running on the tomb in and around 33 AD, that an actual Jesus would have walked out on the third day after his crucifixion and burial.
See, that is the crux of this, isn't it? Is that whether Jesus of Nazareth was resurrected really goes to the absolute essence and heart of Christianity, because obviously if he was, then that is a miracle. And then everyone that believes in Christianity and what it all stands for and Jesus and everything would feel validated by the fact, well, how else do you explain it? So it's at the crux of it. From the text of the New Testament, then, where is the actual hard evidence for you as an historian that that actually happened?
Yeah, I think we do, Piers, have a historical question in terms of we have an actual character who we can demonstrate that lived, and then we have that same character being demonstrated in multiple independent and cross-reference sources, chief of which we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But just because those are religious texts now doesn't necessarily negate that they are historical texts. These were independent written sources that come from the time frame. If we want to know about someone from the ancient world or history in general, we go to the earliest sources, preferably eyewitness sources. And I think that's what we have within the Gospels. So we have a character who lived, who died, and then a character who is said by an early Jesus community to have been resurrected. And the accounts of that are not just kind of scant. They're not seeing Jesus off from afar as some sort of apparition or something like that. Now, what we have is the case of instances of the early Jesus community saying they walked with him, they talked with him, they ate with him. And this happened over the course of, as Luke in his combination, the Gospel of Luke and Acts, says over the course of 40 days. This wasn't a short event. And so there were as many as, Paul says, up to 500 witnesses who took part in this event before his ultimate, resurrecting.
And one of the things that I think about is, well, what if these people didn't remember correctly, right? A lot of times it's like, I don't remember what I had for breakfast last week, right? And so you could post a question to me. It's like, okay, how do you know that these people actually had a clear memory of this event? Well, let me ask you, do you remember what you were doing on 9/11? If you were born during that time? I do. Do you remember, let's choose another example. Do you remember what happened when you first heard about COVID-19 and what it could mean for us? I know exactly where I was, and I know exactly what I was doing when the realization hit me that, oh, I might not be able to work tomorrow, and I might die because of this virus. Like, I know where I was on 9/11. I was 5 years old. I know exactly where I was when I first realized the global pandemic was a thing. And so when something incredibly out of the ordinary or impactful, emotionally impactful happens, you do remember it. And if these people had known Jesus and walked with him and then watched him die and then saw him again, that would have been the 9/11 of that time. They would have remembered it, and they would have remembered it very, very clearly. So let's keep going.
Going to the ascension of the right hand of the Father.
The counter argument is that Paul the Apostle wasn't there for the resurrection himself, and there's no other reference really, other than I think the 1 Corinthians chapter 15.
Okay, so this is where this is fun, because I actually don't know the answer to this, so I'm going to learn this along with you guys, because sometimes I like to do blind reactions to
There's
this
only
stuff.
one other reference to the fact that 500 people witnessed this. Does any of that, in your eyes, put more doubt on it?
I don't think so, because I think when we look at something that we can try to historiographically explain, we look at the various explanations and then we account for the data. So you're correct in the sense that 1 Corinthians 15 is the only place that's mentioned where we talk about these 500 witnesses who saw Jesus all at once. However, when you corroborate those with the accounts that we find particularly in Matthew, Luke, and John, I think it does explain, especially when you have the instance at the ascension in Matthew and Luke, that those 500 people could have been the individuals on the mount when Jesus ascended. Even the fact that we have one instance of this being spoken about, and then we can look at the individuals, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then others in the New Testament documents that talk about the resurrection of Jesus, that, even James, the brother of Jesus, in the Epistle of James, referring to his brother as our glorious Lord, a title that is attributed only to the God of Israel, Yahweh. So I think we have to explain these particular instances where we don't just have people who are friendly to this happening, but we have individuals who are actually hostile. In James, brother of Jesus, who the Gospels tell us that Jesus' family was actually very hesitant in how public Jesus' ministry was. Then we have likewise Paul, who started his life as a persecutor, and that has a radical 180 in terms of him then going on and writing the majority of Holy Scripture within the New Testament.
One of the cool things that I can add to this is there's this really great book. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, found it. There's a really great book by B.B. Warfield called The Lord of Glory, and basically it goes through, I'll hold it up here in case you want it, B.B. Warfield. It goes through all of the instances in the New Testament where Jesus is called Lord. And what I learned from this is that when Paul calls Jesus Lord, he's not calling him Lord in the small sense. He's calling him Lord in the absolute sense, the way that Yahweh in the Old Testament is called Lord. And for him to be hostile to Christianity and then do a complete 180 and start ascribing a word that in the Greek Septuagint, they replaced the word, Yahweh with the Greek word kurios, which is Lord in our language. All Jews who grew up reading the Greek Septuagint would in their mind have associated the word Lord with Yahweh, just the way that we associate the word God with God the Father, or God Almighty, or Yahweh. And so everyone who read Paul would have been very struck by why is he calling this man a title that was reserved only for Yahweh and the Father. That would have really, really hit them, and I think that the labels that they're giving to Jesus after his resurrection is also evidence to the fact that what these people actually believed that they saw. And so, yeah, let's keep going.
Now, again, to play devil's advocate,
Again,
the argument against it goes, look, all these witnesses were likely to have been pretty primitive, mostly illiterate people. Eyewitness testimony notoriously is unreliable. It's the least credible evidence in a courtroom these days, for example. And since the historical method doesn't deal with miracles, it's ridiculous, people say, to base any history on it. And even Matthew's gospel tells us when Jesus appeared in front of his 11 disciples, some of them doubted. To which people say, well, if even not all his disciples believe this, why on earth should we?
Yeah, I think there are a few things going on there. In terms of the historical method and how we actually evaluate things, we only have witness testimony. You do have something that's very different than a courtroom in a modern legal setting, right? Even something like hearsay. Well, all of ancient history, in one sense, is hearsay, but that doesn't apply when we apply it to the historiographical method. We need to use the same standards that when we would look at something like, say, the biographies of Tiberius with Velleius Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassiodeo. When we have multiple instances of reporting on someone's life, we look at both the things that they agree on and the things maybe where they have a differentiation in detail, and then we try, to the best of our ability, explain some of the different instances that are going on. Now, I would say, to the accusation, well, these are just ancient, illiterate people. That's what C.S. Lewis referred to as chronological snobbery. Just because people are ancient neither means they're stupid nor that they don't know what's going on. And what we have in terms of...
I mean, don't forget, these people, like, they built the pyramids, right? They had a functioning society at some point. Like, they weren't dumb. And don't forget that in the temple, they didn't have... Okay, this is really important for you guys to know. They didn't have paper the way we have paper today. This is William Lane Craig's book, Reasonable Faith. I recommend it. They didn't have paper the way we had paper today. So if you read the New Testament, people would gather at the temple to hear the Old Testament, the scriptures, read aloud. Well, what's the point of reading it aloud if you're just going to forget, right? These people were trained from birth to remember what was read aloud to them so that they could pass it on orally because they couldn't write it down. Right? And so when you've been practicing and practicing and practicing and practicing, remembering things that are said to you instead of writing them down, you probably get really, really darn good at it. So these people are probably a lot more orally literate and great at memorizing things than we are. Just my 2 cents on that.
This event is really early on after Jesus' death. We have an explanation of what if the resurrection didn't take place, what we would expect. The 11 disciples are hiding in the upper room. They're scared. They're aware of other messianic movements in the ancient world. Individuals like Simon Bar Giora, who claimed to be the Messiah when his movement was squashed. So when he died, when he died, his movement was squashed. And so I think we have to look at, okay, what explains these 11 scared disciples then going on to not just proclaim that Jesus did rise from the dead, but actually went to the point of risking their lives in persecution. And some of them did die for that proclamation. And so I think...
Exactly. I actually, because, I don't want to just be another reaction channel. I want to actually provide extra stuff for you guys. If you appreciate that, please hit the like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. But this is from Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig, someone who I've also had the privilege of meeting briefly. Actually, the same time I met Wes Huff. That was back when he debated Jordan Peterson once. I actually saw that live. Okay, this is a quote from Paley. Would men in such circumstances pretend to have been what they never saw? Pretend to have seen what they never saw? Assert facts which they had not knowledge of? Go about lying to teach virtue? And though not only convinced of Christ being an impostor, but have seen the success of his imposture in his crucifixion, yet consist in carrying on, and so persist as to bring upon themselves for absolutely nothing, no gain whatsoever, and with full knowledge of the consequence, enmity and hatred, danger and death. If they were fakers, if they were liars, if they knew Jesus was an impostor, why would they go to their grave saying that he was what they knew he wasn't? Especially when there was no reward. Like, I can understand false preachers and, prosperity gospel guys continuously to hawk their bastardized version of Christianity because they make so much money from it. They get wealthy. The apostles didn't get wealthy from continuing to teach Christ resurrected after everyone saw him die. They didn't get wealthy. No, they were killed. And so to me, it doesn't make sense that they would do that if they didn't actually believe that they had seen Jesus. Anyways, let's continue.
It's not outside of the realm of possibility for history to actually be able to evaluate this evidence and say, okay, we have these questions. How then do we explain something like an empty tomb, or even Jesus's disciples go back and the account of the Pentecost happens in Jerusalem. So Jesus' disciples go back to the scene of the crime in the town where people would have saw him crucified, and now they're proclaiming he's resurrected. Well, why would you go back to the place where people could have actually known what actually happened, especially if you're trying to be disingenuous or dishonest? And then that's where it happens. And you know, Stephen is the first martyr. That also happens in Jerusalem. That would have been a warning shot across the bow for the disciples if they wanted to continue on proclaiming these things. They would have realized that this is controversial, both in Jewish circles and in Gentile circles, to be proclaiming these things, to be declaring Jesus as Lord. You know, one of the earliest confessions of Christianity was Jesus is Lord, when the society was saying Caesar is Lord. And so there were risks politically, there were risks religiously, and yet the disciples go on to proclaim these things, even to the detriment of their own lives.
What do you say when people say, well, look, there are parts of the New Testament that allude to Jesus as Nazareth as being the Son of God, and then there are parts where he appears to be God himself? How do you counter that argument that there's an inconsistency there?
Yeah, so Son of God is a title that is reserved for not differentiating Jesus from God. You know, in John's gospel in particular, we have instance where Jesus is referring to himself as the Son of God in a way that actually has the Jews picking up stones to stone him. And when he says, you know, what are these good works are you going to stone me for? They say, not for your good works, but because you call Jesus your Father, making yourself equal with God. And, you know, Jesus then, he doesn't say, oh, no, you've misunderstood me. You know, my Muslim friends like to point out that there are multiple sons of God throughout the Bible. David was referred to as the Son of God. But what's unique is that despite there being, sometimes my Muslim friends like to say sons by the tons, despite that reality, that Jesus is not claiming to be a son of God, he's claiming to be the Son of God in a unique way that not only puts him on equal footing with the Father, but in this monotheistic context of ancient Judaism, actually ascribes to himself honors, attributes, names, and deeds that only God himself has the right to hold. And so the Jews throughout the New Testament, throughout Jesus's ministry and his goings on, they aren't confused by the things he says. You know, when he...
And you know, one of the things that we can actually expand upon there is, why would being the Son of God make them think he's committing blasphemy by making himself equal to God? Is the Son not supposed to be lower than the Father? So why would him being the Son make him equal to God? Well, let's think about this. There's actually only 3 ways in which you can be somebody's son. You can be the son by procreation. You could be the son by adoption. Or you could be the son by nature. Okay, my father and I share the same nature. We are both human males. Now, by our nature, we have a beginning. We are born. But by God's nature, he is eternal. He is not born. God's nature is omnipresent, omnipotent, and all-powerful. And so we are sons of God by adoption. Some of the angels and created beings, you could say, are sons of God by procreation or creation. That doesn't make them equal to God. What makes Jesus equal to the Father is that he is the Son of God by nature, meaning he is eternal, omnipresent, all-powerful, and all-knowing. Of course, the Old Testament tells us that there is only one of those beings, which means Jesus is committing blasphemy by saying he is the only Son and that the Father is his own Father, and they picked up stones to stone him. He's not saying he's the Son of God by procreation or creation. He is the Son of God by nature, meaning that he is everything that God is. And that's why they killed him. Just adding that. We'll probably go into that a bit more detail on this channel. And so if you're enjoying this, like and subscribe. And we'll keep doing this.
At the beginning of Mark's gospel, when he forgives the sins of a person, their response is, who can forgive sins but God alone? And they're exactly right. Only God can forgive our sins. And so Jesus is, in his kind of answer, saying, you know, I'm doing this so that you know that the Son of Man can forgive sins. It's not a correction. That's a reframing in saying, yes, you're right. Only God can forgive sins. That's what I'm doing. Who does that make me?
I've seen Ricky Gervais on various talk shows. He's one of the world's most famous atheists. And he says, look, there are 3,000 gods if you add them all up from all the religions. You know, who's to say your one's the real one? And what about the others then? Do they not exist? Are they not real gods? In other words, his position is, look, you can't all be right unless there are 3,000 different versions of a supernatural spiritual being overseeing us all. What do you say to him?
Yeah, well, I think it's a rather foolish argument in that competition doesn't negate objective reality. So say we're using a courtroom analogy. If someone was convicted of a crime here in the city of Toronto, where I live, and he stood before a judge and he said, really, you think I committed this crime? Do you know how many people are in the city? We have 3 million people in the city. And you think I'm the one who did the crime? Really? Out of all the, how many people are in Toronto? How many people are in Ontario? How many people are in Canada? How many people are in North America? You really think
that's where I live,
that given the amount of people that are on this earth, I'm the one who committed the crime? We wouldn't then look at the judge and say, well, that's a good argument. Have you really thought about how many other people are around who, just because this particular individual you think committed the crime? Really? Well, no, we don't just arbitrarily, pick someone, or in the case of Christianity, pick a God. We believe that the God of the Bible is the true God based on the evidence of not just what we find in the Bible, but, the fine-tuning of the universe, of the morality in the objective reality of this world, and the fact that we are, Piers, people who operate with morals, with meaning and intention, and have intrinsic worth. But we look at these things and we don't arbitrarily pick Yahweh, the God of the Bible, over Zeus and Thor and Allah and Buddha. We do it, I would argue, based on the concrete, publicly available evidence that points to the truth claims that I would argue Christianity answers in regards to the ultimate questions we have.
This is the very question
Great. Well, that's the end of that. If you guys enjoyed that, if you guys enjoyed the things that I added, and if you made it this far and you're interested in having another YouTube channel where we talk about embracing masculinity and just trying to help build God's kingdom instead of just our own kingdoms, but also, trying to live a good life as well, hit the like and subscribe button. If you made it this far, you may as well subscribe because you obviously liked it. Let's be real. You don't come this far in the video unless you like it. So hit the subscribe button, and I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.